The transport ship dropped out of hyperspace with a gentle hum that Jake Morrison barely noticed. He pressed his face against the small window and stared at the massive space station floating in the darkness ahead. Nexus Prime University looked nothing like the colleges back on Earth. Instead of brick buildings and green lawns, it was a collection of silver towers connected by glass tubes, all spinning slowly around a central hub that sparkled with thousands of lights. Jake felt his stomach twist with nerves. He was the first human exchange student to attend Nexus Prime in over 100 years. The university was famous throughout the galaxy for having the best teachers and the smartest students from dozens of different alien species. His acceptance letter had surprised everyone back home, including himself. The docking process took another hour. Jake gathered his single bag and followed the other passengers through a series of airlocks that led into the station proper. The corridors were wide and tall, designed to accommodate species much larger than humans. The walls were a soft blue color that seemed to glow from within, and the air smelled faintly of something like cinnamon mixed with ozone. Other students moved through the hallways in small groups. Jake saw tall, thin beings with silver skin that reflected the light like mirrors. There were shorter, stockier aliens with thick fur and large eyes that reminded him of otters. A group of insect-like creatures chittered to each other as they walked on 4 legs, their wings folded neatly against their backs. Everyone stared at Jake as he passed. He supposed humans were still pretty rare out here in the galaxy. Most of the other species had been part of the Galactic Council for thousands of years, while Earth had only made contact 3 centuries ago. Humans mostly kept to themselves in their own little corner of space. Jake found his dormitory building after asking directions twice. His room was simple but comfortable, with a bed that adjusted to his size and a desk that could change height. The best part was the huge window that looked out at the stars. He unpacked his few belongings and tried to get some sleep, but excitement kept him awake most of the night. The next morning, Jake made his way to the academic sector for his first class. The hallways here were even more impressive, with high ceilings and walls covered in what looked like living crystal formations that pulsed with soft light. Students from dozens of species hurried past, carrying tablets and data pads. Jake found Professor Veltar's classroom and stepped inside. The room was arranged in a circle with seats that could adjust to fit different body types. About 20 students were already there, talking quietly among themselves. The conversation stopped when Jake entered. "You must be the humans," said a voice from across the room. Jake turned to see a tall alien with pale blue skin and large silver eyes. She had no hair, but delicate ridges ran across her scalp in intricate patterns. "I am Lyra from the Altarian Collective. We have heard much about your species." Jake took a seat next to her. "Nice to meet you." "I'm Jake Morrison from Earth." A mechanical voice spoke up from behind them. "Fascinating. A human in our ancient galactic conflicts course." Jake turned to see what looked like a robot, but with organic curves and glowing circuits visible beneath translucent panels. "I am Corvin of the Mechanoid Republic. Your species has quite a reputation." Before Jake could ask what that meant, another student approached. This one looked like a giant praying mantis, but with softer features and clothing that seemed to be woven from silk. "I am Thys of the Hive Worlds," she said, her voice producing harmonics that made it sound like multiple people speaking at once. "We are curious to learn your perspectives." Jake was about to respond when the professor entered the room. Veltar was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The alien was tall and angular, made of what appeared to be living crystal that shifted colors as it moved. Its voice resonated from somewhere inside its crystalline body, creating an echo effect that filled the room. "Welcome, students. To ancient galactic conflicts," Professor Veltar said, the crystal formations on its head pulsing with each word. "This semester we will examine the great military engagements that shaped our galaxy over the past 2 millennia. We begin today with the Great Silence Wars, which occurred 800 years ago between the Vorthon Empire and the Kepler Federation." The professor activated a holographic display in the center of the room. It showed 2 star systems connected by shipping lanes with small icons representing military fleets positioned at various points. Jake leaned forward, immediately interested. The Vorthon Empire controlled the northern trade routes, Professor Veltar continued, while the Kepler Federation dominated the southern passages. Tensions had been building for decades over shipping rights and territorial boundaries. Jake studied the display carefully. The fleet positions looked familiar somehow, like chess pieces arranged on a board. He could see the supply lines, the defensive positions, the natural choke points where battles would likely occur. The first major engagement occurred here, the professor said, highlighting a system near the border between the two territories. The Vorthen fleet, consisting of 200 heavy cruisers and support vessels, met the Kepler force of similar size in what became known as the Battle of Silent Station. As Professor Veltar described the battle, Jake found himself mentally analyzing the tactics. The Vorthen commander had tried a direct frontal assault against prepared defensive positions. The Kepler forces had used their knowledge of local asteroids fields to set up ambush points. It was a fairly standard engagement, but Jake could see several missed opportunities. The battle lasted 3 days, the professor continued, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides before the Vorthen forces withdrew. Can anyone analyze what factors determined the outcome? Lyra raised her hand. The Kepler Federation had better knowledge of local space conditions. They used the asteroid field to their advantage. Correct, Professor Veltar said. Corvin? The mechanical student spoke up. The Vorthen Empire's supply lines were overextended. They could not maintain the engagement as long as the defending force. Also correct, Thais. Both sides suffered unnecessary losses due to poor coordination between their fleet elements, the insect-like alien observed. Jake raised his hand tentatively. Professor Veltar's crystalline head turned toward him, colors shifting to what might have been curiosity. Yes, Jake Morrison of Earth? Well, Jake began, aware that every eye in the room was on him. The Vorthen commander made several strategic errors. If I were running that attack, I would have sent a small force to engage the main Kepler fleet while using the majority of my ships to attack their supply bases and civilian shipping. Force them to spread their defenses thin. The room went quiet. Jake continued, warming to the subject. Also, instead of a direct assault on prepared positions, I would have used some of my smaller ships as decoys. Make it look like the main attack was coming from one direction while the real force hit them from behind. And if the goal was to control the trade routes, why fight the enemy fleet at all? Just mine the shipping lanes and blockade their ports. Starve them out. Professor Veltar's colors had shifted to what Jake hoped was not alarm. The other students were staring at him with expressions that ranged from fascination to horror. That is, the professor said slowly, a remarkably different perspective on the engagement. Jake realized he might have said something wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. Back in his military history classes on Earth, this kind of tactical analysis was completely normal. Every student was expected to think about alternative strategies and identify mistakes made by historical commanders. Perhaps, Professor Veltar continued, we should move on to the next phase of the conflict. The rest of the class continued. But Jake noticed that his fellow students kept glancing at him with what looked like nervous curiosity. When the session ended, they filed out quickly, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Jake packed up his notes and headed for the door, wondering if he had somehow failed his very first class at the most prestigious university in the galaxy. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's first day at Nexus Prime University, and he was starting to notice a pattern. Every time Professor Veltar discussed a historical battle, Jake could see things that the other students missed. More concerning was the fact that his classmates and teachers seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his observations. The morning sun streamed through the crystal walls of the classroom as students took their seats for another lesson on ancient galactic conflicts. Jake had learned to sit in the back row after noticing how his presence seemed to make the other students nervous. Lyra still smiled at him politely, but she no longer sat nearby. Corvin's mechanical responses had become shorter and more formal. Even Thais, whose insect-like features made her emotions hard to read, seemed to tilt away from him when he spoke. Professor Veltar activated the holographic display at the center of the room. This time it showed a different star system, with dozens of planets connected by bright lines representing trade routes and military patrol paths. Today we examined the Theta Nebula campaigns, the professor announced, his crystalline body shifting to a deep blue color. This conflict lasted 15 years and involved 7 different species. It began as a dispute over mining rights in the nebula's outer rim. Jake studied the display carefully. The nebula was positioned at a strategic crossroads where 3 major shipping lanes intersected. Whoever controlled it would have enormous influence over galactic trade. The setup reminded him of historical conflicts back on Earth, where control of key waterways or mountain passes had determined the fate of entire civilizations. The defending coalition consisted of the peaceful Meridian Union, Supported by the Collective Assembly and the Order of Tranquil Worlds, Professor Veltar continued, they faced an aggressive expansion by the hegemony forces, who claimed ancient territorial rights to the entire nebula region. As the professor described the initial battles, Jake found himself mentally mapping out the conflict. The defending coalition had superior numbers but were spread across too wide an area. The hegemony forces were smaller but more concentrated and mobile. It was a classic case of quantity versus quality, with the added complexity of fighting in a nebula, where sensors and communications would be limited. The first major engagement occurred at the Battle of Meridian Station, Professor Veltar said, highlighting a space station near the nebula's edge. The hegemony forces launched a surprise attack with their entire fleet, hoping to capture this vital supply depot. Jake raised his hand before he could stop himself. The professor's colors shifted to what Jake had learned meant reluctant attention. Yes, Jake Morrison? Professor. The defenders made a serious tactical error by concentrating all their supplies at one station, Jake said, aware that the room was growing quiet again. If I were the hegemony commander, I wouldn't attack the station at all. I'd just blockade it and wait for them to starve. Better yet, I'd send a small force to make noise near the station while my main fleet hit their undefended colonies behind the lines. Lyra made a soft sound that might have been distress. But Jake, that would mean attacking civilian populations. Exactly, Jake replied, not understanding why she looked so horrified. You force them to pull their military forces back to defend their people. Classic strategy. Sun Tzu wrote about it thousands of years ago. Professor Veltar's crystalline form had turned an alarming shade of orange. Perhaps we should focus on what actually happened in the battle. But Jake was warming to the subject now. Actually, Professor, the whole setup is wrong. Why fight pitched battles at all? The nebula has dense gas clouds that would interfere with sensors and communications. Perfect for guerrilla warfare. The defenders should have used small, fast ships to hit supply convoys and retreat into the nebula. Make the enemy afraid to leave their bases. The room was completely silent now. Jake looked around at his classmates and saw expressions ranging from shock to what looked like fear. Corvin's optical sensors were blinking rapidly, which Jake had learned meant the mechanical being was processing disturbing information. Furthermore, Jake continued, not noticing the atmosphere in the room, they could have used the asteroids in the nebula to create improvised weapons. Strap engines to large rocks and send them on collision courses with enemy ships. Or better yet, hollow out asteroids and pack them with explosives. Turn them into guided missiles. Professor Veltar's colors had shifted through several alarming shades before settling on a deep red that Jake suspected meant something very bad. Jake Morrison, perhaps you could explain why you immediately think of such violent alternatives. Jake blinked, confused. Because they work? I mean, these are all standard military tactics. Every commander in history has used similar strategies when facing superior numbers. Human history, Thais said quietly, her harmonious voice carrying what sounded like sadness. This is how humans think about conflict. Well, yes, Jake said, still not understanding the problem. How else would you think about it? The whole point of warfare is to win with minimum losses to your own side while inflicting maximum damage on the enemy. Lyra was staring at him with her large silver eyes. Jake, do you not see other solutions? Ways to resolve the conflict without causing such destruction? Jake thought about it seriously. I suppose they could try negotiating, but from weak positions like this, the enemy has no incentive to make a fair deal. You have to demonstrate strength first, then negotiate from a position where both sides have something to lose. The class continued, but Jake noticed that Professor Veltar avoided calling on him for the rest of the session. When they discussed the final outcome of the Theta Nebula campaigns, Jake bit his tongue to avoid pointing out the dozen ways the war could have ended much sooner, with decisive action. After class, Jake walked alone through the crystal corridors toward his next lecture. He passed groups of students who stopped talking when they saw him, and resumed their conversations in hushed tones after he passed. Word was spreading throughout the university about the human student who thought about war in ways that disturbed everyone else. His next class was Comparative Political Systems with Professor Morak, an elderly alien who looked like a cross between a turtle and a tree. The subject matter was supposed to be safer than military history, focusing on how different species organized their governments and societies. Professor Morak was discussing the peaceful expansion period when the Harmony Confederation had spread across 50 star systems in just 2 centuries. The professor described it as a model of how advanced civilizations could grow through voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit. Jake listened carefully to the description and found himself taking detailed notes. Something about the expansion pattern bothered him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The way the Harmony Confederation had approached other species, offering trade agreements and cultural exchanges, gradually building relationships until the other governments voluntarily joined their confederation. When Professor Morak opened the floor for questions, Jake raised his hand cautiously. "Professor, could you explain more about how the Harmony Confederation convinced other species to join voluntarily? The process you described sounds very gradual and systematic." Professor Morak's turtle-like features arranged themselves into what Jake thought was a smile. "Certainly, Jake Morrison. The Confederation was a master of what they called cultural synthesis. They would study each new species they encountered, learning their values, needs, and social structures. Then they would craft trade agreements and cultural exchange programs specifically designed to appeal to each species." Jake nodded, writing faster. "And what happened to species that chose not to join?" "Well, very few refused," Professor Morak replied. "The Confederation's offerings were always quite generous and mutually beneficial. But what about the ones that did refuse?" Jake pressed gently. Professor Morak paused, his ancient features thoughtful. "There were a few cases, but they were rare. Usually, those species found themselves increasingly isolated as their neighbors joined the Confederation. Trade routes shifted away from them, cultural exchanges decreased, and they gradually found themselves at an economic disadvantage." Jake stopped writing and stared at his notes. The pattern was becoming clear, and it wasn't as peaceful as it sounded. "Professor," he said slowly, "that sounds like economic warfare. Isolate the target, control their trade routes, apply economic pressure until they have no choice but to surrender. It's actually quite brilliant." The classroom went dead silent. Professor Morak's expression shifted from friendly interest to something that looked like alarm. "I beg your pardon?" the professor said. Jake looked up from his notes, suddenly aware that once again, every eye in the room was focused on him with expressions of shock and dismay. "The Harmony Confederation wasn't expanding peacefully," Jake explained, not understanding why everyone looked so upset. "They were using systematic psychological and economic warfare. Study the target, identify their weaknesses, isolate them from potential allies, then squeeze them until they submit. It's actually more effective than military conquest because the victims convince themselves they're making a free choice." Professor Morak paused, his ancient features thoughtful. "There were a few cases, but they were rare. Usually those species found themselves increasingly isolated as their neighbors joined the Confederation. Trade routes shifted away from them, cultural exchanges decreased, and they gradually found themselves at an economic disadvantage." Jake stopped writing and stared at his notes. The pattern was becoming clear, and it wasn't as peaceful as it sounded. "Professor," he said slowly, "that sounds like economic warfare. Isolate the target, control their trade routes, apply economic pressure until they have no choice but to surrender. It's actually quite brilliant." The classroom went dead silent. Professor Morak's expression shifted from friendly interest to something that looked like alarm. "I beg your pardon?" the professor said. Jake looked up from his notes, suddenly aware that once again every eye in the room was focused on him with expressions of shock and dismay. "The Harmony Confederation wasn't expanding peacefully," Jake explained, not understanding why everyone looked so upset. "They were using systematic psychological and economic warfare. Study the target, identify their weaknesses, isolate them from potential allies, then squeeze them until they submit. It's actually more effective than military conquest because the victims convince themselves they're making a free choice." Professor Morak's turtle-like head retreated slightly into his shell. "Jake Morrison, I think you may be misinterpreting the historical record." But Jake was reading through his notes again, and the pattern was unmistakable. "No, sir, it's all here in your lecture. Classic conquest strategy. Just using economics and culture instead of armies. Probably caused less immediate damage but achieved the same results. Quite sophisticated, actually." The class ended early with Professor Morak dismissing everyone after a brief, uncomfortable silence. As students filed out, Jake heard whispered conversations in various alien languages. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. Walking back to his dormitory that evening, Jake reflected on his day. He was starting to realize that his fellow students and professors saw something disturbing in his analysis of historical events. But he couldn't understand what the problem was. Everything he had said was true, wasn't it? Back on Earth, this kind of strategic thinking was completely normal. Military academies taught these concepts as basic principles. History classes analyzed past conflicts to understand how they could have been fought more effectively. It was just logical thinking applied to human behavior and conflict. Jake sat at his desk and stared out at the stars, wondering if being the only human at Nexus Prime University was going to be more challenging than he had expected. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a troubling thought was beginning to form. Maybe the problem wasn't that he was thinking wrong. Maybe the problem was that he was thinking like a human. Jake was eating breakfast in the university dining hall when Dean Rothak approached his table. The massive alien looked like a cross between a bear and a rhinoceros, with thick gray skin and small, intelligent eyes. Students throughout the hall turned to stare as the dean sat down across from Jake with obvious difficulty, the chair creaking under his weight. "Jake Morrison," Dean Rothak said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, "we need to discuss your academic situation." Jake set down his fork, his stomach suddenly tight with worry. "Is there a problem with my grades, sir? I thought I was doing well in my classes." "Your academic performance is excellent," the dean replied. "That is precisely the issue we need to address." Before Jake could ask what that meant, another figure approached their table. This one was human, a woman in her mid-40s with graying brown hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She wore a simple blue uniform that Jake didn't recognize, but something about the way she carried herself reminded him of the military instructors back home. "Jake Morrison, I presume?" the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez. I've been assigned as your cultural liaison and war studies supervisor." Jake shook her hand, confused. "War studies supervisor? I didn't know I needed supervision." Dr. Rodriguez sat down next to Dean Rothak, who was watching their interaction with what might have been relief. "The Galactic Educational Council has decided that human students require additional guidance when participating in courses involving historical conflicts or political analysis." "I don't understand," Jake said. "What did I do wrong?" Dean Rothak leaned forward, his massive hands folded on the table. "Jake Morrison, in the past month you have caused 3 separate professors to request emergency consultations with the University Counseling Services. Professor Veltar has submitted a formal report expressing concern about your analysis of military conflicts. Professor Morak has requested that his lectures be reviewed for content that might trigger what he calls human strategic responses." Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment. "I was just participating in class discussions. Everything I said was historically accurate." "That," Dr. Rodriguez said gently, "is exactly the problem. Your perspectives are accurate, Jake, but they're also deeply disturbing to species that have lived in peace for thousands of years." The dining hall had grown quieter around them as students strained to overhear the conversation. Jake noticed Lyra sitting several tables away, watching them with obvious concern. "Let me explain," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "I've reviewed your class contributions and I understand why you're confused. Back on Earth, the kind of strategic analysis you've been providing would be considered normal, even expected, but the rest of the galaxy doesn't think about conflict the way humans do." Dean Rothak nodded his massive head. "Most species in the Galactic Council have evolved beyond what you might call warfare thinking. They approach historical conflicts as puzzles to be solved through diplomacy and compromise, not military strategy." Jake thought about this for a moment. "But that doesn't make sense. If you're studying military history, shouldn't you try to understand how the battles could have been fought more effectively?" "That," Dr. Rodriguez said with a slight smile, "is a very human assumption. Most species study historical conflicts to understand how they could have been avoided entirely." This was such a foreign concept to Jake that he struggled to wrap his mind around it. But then how do they understand what actually happened? How can you analyze a battle without considering strategy and tactics? "They focus on the diplomatic failures that led to conflict," Dean Rothak explained. "They examine the breakdown of communication, the misunderstandings between cultures, the economic pressures that made violence seem necessary. They study war to prevent it, not to improve it." Dr. Rodriguez opened a tablet and showed Jake several documents. "I've been brought in because the university recognizes that human perspectives have educational value." "Your insights are actually quite brilliant, Jake." The problem is that they're also terrifying to species that haven't fought a war in millennia. She pointed to one of the documents. Your analysis of the Harmony Confederation's expansion, for example. You correctly identified it as a sophisticated conquest strategy, using economic and cultural pressure instead of military force. This is something that galactic historians have debated for centuries without reaching a consensus. Because they don't want to admit it was conquest, Jake said, understanding dawning. They prefer to think of it as peaceful expansion. Exactly, Dr. Rodriguez replied. And when a human student casually explains how it was actually a brilliant military campaign using nonviolent methods, it forces them to confront some uncomfortable truths about their own history. Dean Rothak shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The Galactic Educational Council has determined that human students need guidance to help translate their perspectives into formats that won't cause distress to other species. Jake felt a mix of frustration and confusion. So I'm being censored because I think differently? Not censored, Dr. Rodriguez said firmly. Contextualized. I'm here to help you express your insights in ways that other species can understand and accept. Think of me as a translator between human strategic thinking and galactic academic standards. She turned to a fresh page on her tablet. Starting tomorrow, I'll be observing your classes and providing additional commentary when you contribute to discussions. We'll work together to help your classmates understand the human perspective without overwhelming them. Jake looked around the dining hall. Students were still watching their table, and he could see mixtures of curiosity and nervousness on their alien faces. He thought about Lyra's horrified expression when he had suggested attacking civilian targets, about Corvin's rapidly blinking sensors, about Professor Veltar's alarming color changes. Do they really find my ideas that frightening? He asked. Dean Rothak and Dr. Rodriguez exchanged a look that Jake couldn't interpret. Jake, Dr. Rodriguez said carefully, let me ask you something. When you analyzed the Theta Nebula campaigns, how long did it take you to identify the strategic errors and develop alternative tactics? Jake thought about it. I don't know. Maybe a few seconds. It was pretty obvious once you looked at the setup. And when Professor Morak described the Harmony Confederation's expansion, how quickly did you recognize the conquest pattern? About halfway through his lecture, I guess. The economic isolation strategy became clear once he explained how they dealt with species that refused to join. Dr. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Jake, what you consider obvious strategic thinking took our best military analysts years to develop. The fact that you can see these patterns instantly, almost instinctively, is exactly what makes other species nervous. She leaned forward, her expression serious. Humans have been fighting wars for thousands of years. It's shaped how we think about everything. Politics, economics, social relationships, even art and literature. What you call obvious strategic thinking is actually the result of your species' entire evolutionary and cultural development. Jake began to understand the scope of the problem. So when I analyze historical events, I'm applying thousands of years of human military experience without even realizing it. Precisely, Dean Rothak rumbled, and species that have lived in peace for millennia find that level of strategic sophistication deeply unsettling. Dr. Rodriguez closed her tablet and stood up. The good news is that your perspectives are valuable. The university wants to keep you here and continue learning from human viewpoints. We just need to find ways to share your insights that won't send your professors to counseling. She smiled at Jake's expression. Don't worry, I've been doing this kind of cultural translation for years. Tomorrow we'll start with Professor Veltar's class on the Silicon Wars. I've reviewed the material, and I can already see several points where you'll want to contribute. As Dean Rothak and Dr. Rodriguez left the dining hall, Jake sat alone with his thoughts. He looked over at Lyra's table and caught her eye. She gave him a tentative wave, which he returned with a small smile. For the first time since arriving at Nexus Prime University, Jake began to understand that being human meant more than just being from Earth. It meant carrying the entire weight of human history in his head, whether he wanted to or not. Every time he looked at a conflict or political situation, he was seeing it through the lens of thousands of years of warfare, strategy, and survival. He finished his breakfast and headed to his first class of the day, wondering what it would be like to see the universe through peaceful eyes instead of strategic ones. The thought was both fascinating and deeply alien to him. Tomorrow, Dr. Rodriguez would help him translate his human perspective for his alien classmates. Jake hoped it would work because despite everything, he was starting to like it here, even if his way of thinking did seem to terrify everyone around him. The Museum of Galactic Peace stood at the center of Nexus Prime University like a crystalline monument to civilization. Its walls were made of transparent materials that seemed to shift and flow like water, and inside, holographic displays showed the peaceful achievements of dozens of species across thousands of years. Jake walked beside Dr. Rodriguez as their class followed Professor Veltar through the museum's main corridor. The other students moved in small groups, whispering excitedly about the exhibits. Since Dr. Rodriguez had begun supervising his classes 2 weeks ago, Jake's relationships with his classmates had slowly improved. Lyra now sat near him again, and even Corvin had resumed their discussions about comparative military technologies, though always with Dr. Rodriguez present to provide context. This museum represents the crown jewel of galactic civilization, Professor Veltar announced, his crystalline body shifting to a warm golden color. Here we celebrate the Great Unification, the period when warfare finally ended throughout our galaxy. They stopped before a massive display showing a timeline of galactic history. Jake studied the holographic chart, noting how conflicts had been constant for millennia, with small wars breaking out regularly between various species and empires. Then, about 300 years ago, everything changed dramatically. The Great Unification began approximately 3 centuries ago, Professor Veltar continued. Within 50 years, every major species had signed comprehensive peace treaties. War became obsolete as civilized beings chose cooperation over conflict. Jake frowned at the timeline. Something about the dates bothered him, but he couldn't quite identify what. Dr. Rodriguez was studying the same display with a thoughtful expression. "Professor," Lyra asked, "what caused such a sudden change? Why did all species simultaneously decide to abandon warfare?" Professor Veltar's colors shifted to what Jake had learned indicated uncertainty. Historians believe it was a natural evolution of consciousness. As species became more advanced, they naturally grew beyond the need for violent conflict. Jake opened his mouth to point out the statistical improbability of such simultaneous evolution, but Dr. Rodriguez placed a gentle hand on his arm. She gave him a slight shake of her head, indicating he should wait. They continued through the museum, viewing exhibits about diplomatic breakthroughs, trade agreements, and cultural exchanges. Every display emphasized how reason and cooperation had triumphed over primitive aggressive instincts. In the final hall, they encountered the centerpiece of the museum, a holographic recreation of the signing of the Universal Peace Accord. Representatives from dozens of species stood around a ceremonial table, their various forms unified in a moment of historic cooperation. This ceremony marked the formal end of warfare in our galaxy, Professor Veltar said proudly. Never again would civilized beings resort to violence to resolve their differences. Jake studied the hologram carefully, noting the species represented and their positions around the table. Something about the arrangement struck him as odd, almost like a surrender ceremony rather than a mutual agreement. After the tour ended and the class dispersed for lunch, Dr. Rodriguez approached Jake in the museum's quiet archives section. "You noticed something about the timeline, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Jake nodded. "The dates don't add up. All these species suddenly decided to stop fighting at exactly the same time, about 300 years ago. That's too much of a coincidence." Dr. Rodriguez looked around to make sure they were alone, then activated a privacy screen that would block their conversation from being overheard. "Jake, what I'm about to tell you is classified information that I learned during my briefings before taking this assignment," she said seriously. "The Great Unification didn't happen because the galaxy evolved beyond warfare." She activated her personal tablet and pulled up a restricted file. 300 years ago was when humanity made first contact with galactic civilization. Jake stared at her. "Are you saying there's a connection?" "I'm saying there's a direct causal relationship," Dr. Rodriguez replied. The galaxy had been in a state of constant small-scale warfare for thousands of years. Different species fought over territory, resources, trade routes, cultural differences. It was normal. She showed him a series of historical documents that Jake realized were written from a human perspective rather than the sanitized, galactic version he had been studying. When human explorers first made contact with the Altarian collective, we shared information about our species as part of the diplomatic process. Cultural exchanges, historical records, technological capabilities. Jake read through the documents, his understanding growing with each page. They learned about human military history. All of it, Dr. Rodriguez confirmed. Our wars, our strategies, our willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. The world wars, the Cold War standoffs, the proxy conflicts, the nuclear weapons, the concept of mutually assured destruction. She pulled up another file showing communication intercepts between various alien governments in the years following first contact. Within 5 years of learning about humanity, every major species in the galaxy was holding emergency sessions about what they called the human problem. They realized that if humans ever got involved in galactic conflicts, the scale of destruction would be unlike anything they had ever imagined. Jake felt a chill as he understood the implications. They were afraid of us. Terrified, Dr. Rodriguez said bluntly. Look at this analysis report from the Mechanoid Republic. She showed him a document that had been translated from the original mechanical language. Jake read through assessments of human military capabilities, psychological profiles of human strategic thinking, and projections of what might happen if humans joined existing conflicts. The conclusions were stark. Human involvement in any galactic war would likely escalate beyond anything the current species could handle. Human tactical thinking was described as frighteningly sophisticated, and human willingness to accept casualties was labeled incomprehensible to civilized minds. So they decided to end all warfare, rather than risk humans getting involved, Jake said, the pieces falling into place. Within 50 years of first contact, every species had signed comprehensive peace treaties, Dr. Rodriguez confirmed. They dismantled their military forces, established diplomatic protocols for resolving all disputes, and created the Galactic Council specifically to maintain peace. Jake looked back toward the museum's main hall where his classmates were probably still discussing the exhibits. Do they know? Do any of them realize that humanity accidentally scared the galaxy into peace? Officially. No, the real reasons for the Great Unification are classified at the highest levels. Most people, including your professors and classmates, genuinely believe their species evolved beyond warfare naturally. Dr. Rodriguez closed the files and deactivated the privacy screen. But now you understand why your strategic thinking disturbs them so much. Every time you casually analyze a historical conflict and suggest more effective tactics, you're demonstrating exactly the kind of military sophistication that terrified their governments into ending warfare forever. They walked slowly back through the museum, past displays celebrating peaceful cooperation and diplomatic solutions. Jake saw everything differently now, understanding that beneath the celebration of peace lay a deep, unspoken fear of what humans might bring to any conflict. Is that why I need supervision, he asked. Not because I might say something wrong, but because I might remind them why they're really peaceful. Partly, Dr. Rodriguez admitted. The university administration knows the real history, even if most of the faculty doesn't. They want human perspectives in their academic programs because our insights are valuable. But they also need to make sure those insights don't accidentally reveal truths that might destabilize the entire galactic peace. As they rejoined the class for the afternoon session, Jake found himself looking at his alien classmates with new understanding. Their horrified reactions to his strategic suggestions weren't just cultural differences. They were echoes of the deep fear that had reshaped galactic civilization 3 centuries ago. Lyra smiled at him as he took his seat, and Jake smiled back, wondering what she would think if she knew that her people's commitment to peace was built on terror of what his species might do if war ever returned to the galaxy. Professor Veltar began the afternoon lecture on conflict resolution techniques, describing the sophisticated diplomatic mechanisms that had kept peace for 300 years. Jake listened with fascination, now understanding that every protocol and procedure had been designed with one primary goal: making sure that conflicts never escalated to the point where someone might think to ask the humans for help. The most peaceful civilization in galactic history had been built on the foundation of humanity's reputation for war. Jake wasn't sure whether to be proud or disturbed by this revelation, but he was definitely beginning to understand why his presence at Nexus Prime University required such careful management. As the class ended and students filed out discussing the day's lessons, Jake remained in his seat, contemplating the strange burden of being human in a galaxy that had chosen peace, specifically to avoid becoming like his species. Dr. Rodriguez waited for him by the door. How are you processing all this? She asked as they walked back toward the dormitories. Jake thought carefully before answering. I'm starting to understand that being human means carrying a reputation I never asked for. Everything I say about strategy and tactics isn't just academic discussion. It's a reminder of why the galaxy is afraid of my entire species. That's a mature way to look at it, Dr. Rodriguez said approvingly. The question now is what you do with that understanding. Jake looked up at the stars visible through the crystal ceiling above them. Somewhere out there was Earth, and billions of humans who had no idea that their very existence had reshaped galactic civilization. I guess I learned to be worthy of their trust, he said finally. If the galaxy chose peace because they were afraid of human warfare, maybe I can help them see that humans are capable of more than just strategic thinking. Dr. Rodriguez smiled. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Professor Veltar stood at the center of the classroom, his crystalline form cycling through nervous colors that Jake had never seen before. The morning light streaming through the crystal walls seemed different somehow, more intense and focused. Dr. Rodriguez sat in her usual observation seat, but she was paying closer attention than normal, her tablet ready to record everything. Today we will conduct a special exercise, Professor Veltar announced to the class. The university administration has approved an experimental scenario that will test your understanding of conflict resolution principles. Jake noticed that Dean Rothak was standing in the back of the classroom, his massive form barely fitting through the doorway. This was the first time the dean had personally observed one of their classes, and his presence made the atmosphere feel formal and important. I will present you with a theoretical scenario, Professor Veltar continued, his colors shifting to a more stable blue. Two evenly matched fleets are approaching each other in neutral space. Diplomatic communications have failed and battle appears inevitable. Each of you will propose a solution that avoids this conflict. The holographic display activated, showing two fleets of roughly equal size positioned several light hours apart. Jake studied the tactical situation carefully, noting the ship compositions, positions, and likely approach vectors. His mind immediately began calculating engagement probabilities and strategic options. Lyra of the Altarian Collective, Professor Veltar said, please present your solution first. Lyra stood gracefully, her pale blue skin seeming to glow in the classroom light. I would propose an immediate prisoner exchange. Each fleet could transfer high-ranking officers to the other side as mutual hostages. This would create personal stakes for both commanders, making them reluctant to begin hostilities that might harm their own people. Excellent, Professor Veltar replied, his colors brightening. Corvin of the Mechanoid Republic? The mechanical student's optical sensors focused on the display. I would suggest a resource-sharing agreement. The underlying conflict likely stems from competition for limited resources. If both sides can identify mutually beneficial trade arrangements, the need for conflict disappears. Very logical, Professor Veltar agreed. This of the hive worlds? The insect-like alien stood, her wings rustling softly. I propose a territorial mediation. Neutral species could be called in to oversee the disputed region, while both sides withdraw to safe distances. Time often allows emotions to cool and reason to prevail. Jake had been taking notes on each proposal, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses from a strategic perspective. All three solutions assumed that both sides wanted to avoid conflict and were acting rationally. But real conflicts often involved factors that made peaceful resolution difficult or impossible. Jake Morrison of Earth, Professor Veltar said, his colors shifting to something that might have been anticipation or dread. Jake stood slowly, aware that everyone in the room was watching him with unusual intensity. Dr. Rodriguez had her stylus poised over her tablet, ready to intervene if necessary. Professor, Jake began carefully, I think the scenario as presented has a fundamental flaw. You're assuming that both sides want to avoid conflict, but fleets don't just accidentally encounter each other in neutral space. If they're approaching for battle, someone has decided that violence is their best option. Professor Veltar's colors flickered uncertainly. Please continue with your solution. Jake looked at the tactical display again. If I had to prevent this battle, I would have both fleets secretly redirect to attack each other's home systems simultaneously. When both commanders realize their capitals are under threat, they'd be forced to break off and return home immediately. The classroom went dead silent. Jake could hear the soft hum of the life support systems and the distant sound of students in other hallways. That's still warfare, Lyra said quietly. You're just moving the battle to different locations. Actually, no, Jake replied, warming to his explanation. Neither fleet would actually attack the home systems. It's a deception operation. Both sides think the other's fleet disappeared, so they assume it went to attack their homeworld. They rush back to defend against an attack that isn't really happening. Dice made a soft chittering sound that indicated distress. But that requires elaborate deception and leaves both sides thinking they're under attack. Right, but no one actually gets hurt, Jake explained. Both fleets return home thinking they successfully defended their territory. The immediate conflict is avoided, and you buy time for proper diplomatic solutions. Dean Rothak stepped forward from the back of the room. Jake Morrison, Professor Veltar asked for a peaceful solution. Do you have one that doesn't involve military deception? Jake thought about it seriously. This was the part that Dr. Rodriguez had been helping him with, trying to think about problems the way non-humans might approach them. Well, he said slowly, I suppose you could use elaborate misinformation campaigns to make each side believe the other fleet has been destroyed or has retreated. Monitor their communications, feed them false sensor data, maybe use holographic projections to simulate debris fields. The silence in the room became even more profound. Jake looked around at the faces of his classmates and saw expressions ranging from horror to fascination. You're still thinking about deception and manipulation, Corvin observed, his mechanical voice carrying what sounded like sadness. Even your peaceful solutions involve warfare by other means. Dr. Rodriguez stood up from her observation seat. Perhaps I should provide some context here, she said diplomatically. Jake's suggestions demonstrate what we call strategic thinking in human culture. He's trying to solve the problem by changing the fundamental conditions that make conflict seem necessary. Professor Veltar's colors had shifted to a pattern Jake had never seen before, like oil on water. Dr. Rodriguez, could you explain why Jake Morrison immediately thinks of such complex deception operations? In human military history, Dr. Rodriguez explained carefully, the best victories are often achieved without fighting at all. Jake is applying principles from ancient human strategists who believed that defeating an enemy through intelligence and misdirection was preferable to defeating them through violence. Dean Rothak moved closer to Jake's desk. Jake Morrison, do you understand why your classmates find your solutions disturbing? Jake looked around the room at his alien friends. Lyra was staring at him with her large silver eyes, and he could see something like fear in her expression. Thais had folded her wings tightly against her body, and what he had learned was a defensive posture. Even Corvin's optical sensors were dimmed, indicating emotional distress. I think so, Jake said slowly. You all propose solutions based on the assumption that both sides basically want peace and just need help finding it. But I'm thinking about what to do if one or both sides actually want to fight. Exactly, Dr. Rodriguez said. Human strategic thinking always accounts for the possibility that the other party is acting in bad faith or has goals that make peaceful resolution genuinely impossible. Professor Veltar moved closer to the holographic display. This is most illuminating. Jake Morrison, when you look at this scenario, you see potential for deception, manipulation, and continued conflict even after an apparent resolution. Because that's usually what happens, Jake replied. Peace agreements work great when both sides want peace. But if someone's determined to fight, you need to either change their mind or change their ability to fight effectively. The room remained quiet for a long moment. Jake could see his classmates processing this fundamentally different approach to conflict resolution. Jake, Lyra said finally, do you think our solutions would fail? Jake considered this carefully, aware that his answer might affect his friendships with these people he had come to care about. Your solutions are beautiful, he said honestly. They would work perfectly if both sides were acting in good faith and really wanted to avoid conflict. But prisoner exchanges can be used to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities. Resource-sharing agreements can be exploited to identify weaknesses, and mediation periods can be used to build up forces for a more decisive attack later. Thais made her harmonious voice even softer. You see treachery in everything, don't you? I see possibilities, Jake replied. In human history, every peace treaty has eventually been broken by someone who decided they could get a better deal through violence. So we learn to think about what happens when the other side cheats. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward again. What Jake is demonstrating is something we call strategic paranoia in human military circles. It's not that humans want conflict, but that we assume someone else eventually will. Dean Rothak nodded his massive head thoughtfully. This explains much about human behavior that has puzzled the Galactic Council for centuries. Professor Veltar's colors had settled into a deep, contemplative purple. This exercise has been far more educational than I anticipated. Jake Morrison, your solutions are indeed more complex than what we typically consider, but they account for variables that our traditional approaches ignore. As the class ended and students began filing out, Jake remained at his desk feeling like he had failed some kind of test. His solutions worked, but they clearly disturbed his classmates and professors. Lyra approached his desk hesitantly. Jake, may I ask you something? Of course. When you look at that tactical display, do you see anything besides warfare and deception? Jake looked back at the hologram, trying to see it through her eyes. I see two groups of people who are probably scared, following orders from leaders who think they have no choice but to fight. I see crews with families waiting at home, hoping their loved ones come back safely. Lyra's expression softened. That's what I was hoping you would say. As they walked out of the classroom together, Jake realized that being human in a galaxy that had chosen peace meant carrying the responsibility of understanding both war and the desire to avoid it. His strategic thinking wasn't just an academic exercise. It was a reminder of why peace was worth protecting. Dr. Rodriguez waited for him in the hallway. How do you feel about today's exercise? Jake thought about it as they walked toward the next class. I understand why they find my thinking disturbing, but I also think someone needs to consider the possibilities they don't want to think about. That, Dr. Rodriguez said with a slight smile, is exactly why humans are both feared and needed in this galaxy. The final presentation hall at Nexus Prime University was packed beyond capacity. Students from dozens of species filled every available seat, while faculty members lined the walls. Word had spread throughout the academic community that the human exchange student would be giving his semester-end analysis of how species-specific thinking influenced approaches to conflict resolution. Jake stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of alien faces. In the front row sat his classmates, Lyra with her supportive smile, Corvin with his sensors focused intently on the presentation screen, and Thys with her wings slightly spread in what he had learned indicated excitement. Dr. Rodriguez sat nearby, ready to provide context if needed, while Dean Rothak occupied a specially reinforced chair near the back. Professor Veltar approached the podium, his crystalline form shifting to formal ceremonial colors. Today we will hear from Jake Morrison of Earth, analyzing how his species' historical development has influenced their approach to understanding galactic conflicts. Jake activated the holographic display, showing a timeline of human history. Unlike the sanitized galactic histories he had been studying, this one was filled with wars, conquests, revolutions, and periods of devastating conflict. When most species study history, Jake began, they focus on cultural achievements, scientific discoveries, and social progress. When humans study history, we see something different. The display zoomed in on specific periods, the rise and fall of empires, the development of new military technologies, the strategic innovations that change the nature of warfare itself. Human civilization has been shaped by conflict in ways that are difficult for peaceful species to understand. Every major technological advancement, from metallurgy to space travel, was driven by military needs. Every philosophical concept we value, from democracy to individual rights, emerged from struggles against oppression. Jake could see some of the alien students shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but he continued. This isn't because humans are naturally violent. It's because our planet put us in competition with each other from the beginning. Limited resources, geographic barriers, different environments that led to different cultures. We learned early that survival often meant being better at conflict than our neighbors. He changed the display to show human art and literature. Even our greatest cultural achievements reflect this reality. Our epic poems are about war. Our greatest heroes are warriors or leaders who protected their people from enemies. Our concepts of honor, sacrifice, and justice all come from military traditions. Lyra raised her hand tentatively. Jake, are you saying that human culture is fundamentally based on warfare? I'm saying that human culture is fundamentally based on the need to survive in a competitive environment, Jake replied. Sometimes that meant war, but more often it meant being ready for war while hoping it wouldn't come. Dr. Rodriguez stood up to provide additional context. What Jake is describing is why humans approach all social, political, and economic problems through what we call a strategic framework. We don't think about war as a separate subject. We think about all human interaction as forms of competition or cooperation that could potentially become conflict. The display changed to show examples from Jake's semester at Nexus Prime, including his analyses of the Great Silence Wars and the Harmony Confederation's expansion. When I analyzed these historical events, Jake explained, I wasn't trying to be disturbing or aggressive. I was applying the same analytical tools that humans use to understand all complex situations. We look for power dynamics, resource competition, strategic advantages, and potential points of failure. Professor Veltar's colors shifted to what Jake had learned indicated deep contemplation. Jake Morrison, could you explain why humans need supervision in our academic environment? Jake thought carefully about his answer, aware that this moment would determine how future human students might be received at galactic universities. Because humans don't realize that our way of thinking is unusual, he said finally. To us, strategic analysis feels natural and obvious. We don't understand that other species find it disturbing because we've never experienced a world where strategic thinking wasn't necessary for survival. He gestured toward Dr. Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez is here to help translate between human analytical methods and galactic academic standards, not because humans are dangerous, but because our perspectives can be valuable if they're presented in ways that don't accidentally frighten people. Dean Rothak rose from his reinforced chair. Jake Morrison, do you believe human strategic thinking has value for galactic civilization? Jake looked out at the audience, seeing hundreds of alien faces focused on him with intense curiosity. I think humans see patterns that peaceful species might miss. We notice when diplomatic solutions might fail, when economic agreements might be exploited, when cultural exchanges might be used for intelligence gathering. He paused, choosing his words carefully. That doesn't mean we want these things to happen. It means we're prepared for the possibility that they might happen. In a galaxy that has chosen peace, maybe having someone watch for the exceptions is useful. The display changed to show the universal peace accord from the Museum of Galactic Peace. Dr. Rodriguez told me that the galaxy chose peace partly because they learned about human military capabilities. If that's true, then maybe our role isn't to participate in conflict, but to help prevent it by understanding how it works. I'm saying that someone needs to think about the unthinkable, Jake replied. In a perfect galaxy, everyone would solve problems through cooperation and mutual benefit. But if someone someday decides to break that system, wouldn't it be better to have people who understand how conflict works and how to stop it? The presentation hall was completely silent. Jake could hear the soft background hum of the station's life support systems and the distant sounds of students moving through other corridors. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward to address the audience. The Galactic Educational Council has established what we're calling the Human Studies Supervision Protocol, she announced. Anytime human students or faculty participate in courses involving historical analysis, political science, or strategic studies, they will be accompanied by qualified human cultural advisors. She gestured toward Jake. This isn't because humans are dangerous or need to be controlled. It's because human perspectives offer valuable insights that can enhance galactic understanding. But those insights need to be presented in ways that respect the peaceful nature of current galactic civilization. Professor Veltar's colors shifted to what Jake now recognized as approval mixed with relief. This semester has been educational beyond our initial expectations. Jake Morrison's analysis has forced us to examine our own historical assumptions and consider perspectives we had never encountered. The professor turned toward the audience. We are pleased to announce that Nexus Prime University will be establishing a new course for the coming semester, Comparative Conflict Analysis, taught jointly by myself and Dr. Rodriguez. This course will explore how different species approach the study of historical conflicts and political challenges. A murmur of excitement ran through the assembled students. Jake noticed that many of them were leaning forward in their seats, clearly interested in learning more about human strategic thinking, despite their initial fear of it. Dean Rothak stood again, his massive form commanding attention. The university administration has also decided to expand our human exchange program. We will be accepting additional human students, though we recommend they come from backgrounds in arts, literature, or basic sciences rather than military history. Jake smiled at this, understanding the diplomatic way the dean was saying that one Jake Morrison per semester was probably enough for everyone's peace of mind. Lyra raised her hand again. Jake, now that you understand how we think about conflict, has it changed your perspective? Jake considered this carefully. It's made me realize that peace isn't just the absence of war. Peace is a choice that has to be actively maintained. Your species have chosen to build a civilization based on cooperation and mutual respect, and that's something worth protecting. He looked around the room at all the alien faces, but it's also made me realize that humans might have a role to play in protecting that peace, not by participating in conflicts, but by understanding them well enough to prevent them. Corvin's mechanical voice carried what sounded like curiosity. Would you return to Nexus Prime if invited? Absolutely, Jake replied without hesitation. I've learned more here than I ever expected to, not just about galactic history, but about what it means to be human in a universe that's chosen a different path. Dr. Rodriguez smiled. Actually, Jake has already been accepted into our graduate program. He'll be spending the next 2 years helping to develop the new comparative conflict analysis curriculum. The announcement brought applause from the audience, though Jake noticed it was the polite academic applause of people who were genuinely interested, but still slightly nervous about the subject matter. As the presentation ended and students began filing out, Jake's classmates approached the podium. Lyra was the first to reach him. Jake, I want you to know that despite how frightening your ideas sometimes are, I'm glad you're here, she said sincerely. You've made me think about peace in ways I never considered before. Thais chittered agreement. Your perspectives have shown us that our peaceful galaxy exists partly because others have thought about the alternatives we prefer to ignore. Even Corvin seemed pleased. Your strategic analysis capabilities are remarkably sophisticated. I look forward to studying these comparative approaches in the new course. As his classmates left to celebrate the end of the semester, Jake remained in the presentation hall with Dr. Rodriguez and Professor Veltar. How do you feel about staying here for graduate studies? Dr. Rodriguez asked. Jake looked around the now empty hall, thinking about everything that had happened during his first semester at Nexus Prime. I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be. The galaxy has spent 300 years trying to forget how conflict works, but someone needs to remember. Professor Veltar's colors shifted to what Jake had learned was deep respect. Jake Morrison, your presence here has been challenging but invaluable. You have forced us to confront aspects of galactic history that we had chosen to overlook. The professor paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. Perhaps most importantly, you have shown us that understanding warfare and choosing peace are not contradictory concepts. They may, in fact, be complementary. As they walked out of the presentation hall together, Jake reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He had come to Nexus Prime University as a simple exchange student, interested in military history. Now he was becoming something entirely new, a bridge between humanity's strategic heritage and the galaxy's peaceful aspirations. The corridors of the university buzzed with conversations about the presentation. Jake could hear students from various species discussing human strategic thinking, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with lingering nervousness, but always with respect. Dr. Rodriguez walked beside him as they headed back toward the dormitory sector. You know, Jake, what you've accomplished here goes beyond just academic success. You've helped the galaxy begin to understand that humans aren't a threat to their peace. You're potential guardians of it. Jake nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with this role. Someone has to think about the things that peaceful people don't want to think about. If that's what humans are good at, then maybe that's how we can contribute to galactic civilization. They passed through the crystal corridors lined with artwork from dozens of worlds, representations of the cultural achievements that flourished in a galaxy at peace. Jake realized that his role wasn't to change this peaceful civilization, but to help protect it by understanding the forces that could threaten it. As they reached his dormitory, Dr. Rodriguez handed him a data pad containing his course schedule for the graduate program. Your first class will be Introduction to Peaceful Diplomatic Theory. I thought you might find it interesting to study how other species approach problems without considering military solutions. Jake smiled as he looked at the schedule. I think learning to see the universe through peaceful eyes might be the most valuable education I could receive. The next morning, Jake stood at his window looking out at the stars. Somewhere among those points of light was Earth, where humans continued their long history of strategic thinking and competitive survival. And here, at the center of galactic civilization, was a university dedicated to understanding and preserving peace. Jake had become something unique, a human who understood both perspectives. He carried in his mind the strategic wisdom of human military history, but he also carried the responsibility of using that knowledge to protect, rather than threaten, the peaceful galaxy that had given him this opportunity. His communicator chimed with a message from Lyra, asking if he wanted to join her study group for the new comparative conflict analysis course. Jake smiled and replied that he would be happy to attend, looking forward to learning alongside friends who were no longer afraid of human strategic thinking, but curious about how it could be used to serve peace. The first human student at Nexus Prime University in over a century had become something more